Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar over this Thursday lunchtime. So today's webinar, we're going to be talking about maximising your legacy. So we've got around about 45 minutes and hopefully we'll cover some interesting and useful topics. So firstly, just an introduction to those that don't know me. So my name is Simon. I'm a chartered financial planner at New World Financial Group. So we help people in all stages of life make good financial decisions for their future. This webinar is being recorded and we've had a few requests that it is recorded. So if you would like a copy of it afterwards, please just let us know and we'll be happy to send that to you. So today's agenda. So we're going to keep things fairly high level because we do have a bit of a time constraint, and I guess the area that we are covering can get quite complex. So we'll keep things fairly high level for the moment. So firstly, we're going to talk about leaving a legacy and what that actually means, and then we're going to spend quite a lot of the presentation covering inheritance tax. So what actually is it? How is it calculated? Who pays it? And then we'll look at kind of options available for potentially mitigating the impact of a potential inheritance tax liability, and also how you can start to plan for that as well. And we're going to finish off with some of our top tips. So these are things that you can either start doing now or consider doing in the future as well. So first and foremost, leaving a legacy. So, what is a legacy? Well, you can see there that line in bold there is it's effectively a definition of a lasting legacy. So the positive impact that your life has on other people. Now, there are lots of different ways to leave a legacy, and they can take various forms. So it could be a personal legacy, professional, philanthropic. But in this webinar, we're going to focus on helping others through financial means. So traditionally, money and assets have been passed down to family members on death. However, with advancements in healthcare and people's general well-being, what we're finding is that life expectancies are they're growing. So people are living much longer now than they ever used to. So this can often lead to situations where inheritances are being received by relatives, so that may be children, who may already be in some cases retired themselves, or at least a certain point along their life where actually they don't necessarily have, a great need for an inheritance. So instead, what's becoming kind of more and more common is actually, maybe using funds perhaps in smaller proportions earlier on. So ultimately, whilst you're still alive, and being able to see firsthand the impact of these gifts or purchases, and often that can be, actually quite fulfilling to actually see the benefits of those gifts in practice. And of course, it doesn't have to be, just passing things on to family members. It may be a case of using funds to support a particular cause, a charity, or something similar. Another benefit, I suppose, of gifting earlier in life is that it helps to give you, a little bit more control over how any funds that you gift or any assets that you gift are used, who uses them, and also it can help to potentially mitigate any future tax liability, so inheritance tax. Which is what we're going to talk about next. But I just thought it was quite useful just to kind of give an overview of what exactly it means, I suppose, to leave a legacy. So, very simply, what is inheritance tax? So ultimately, inheritance tax is one that's imposed on the value of assets or property that a person leaves behind. So this is known as their estate. when they pass away. So there is what we call a nil rate band. So this is effectively an allowance. So ultimately, if the value of somebody's estate is within this nil rate band, then no inheritance tax is due. If the value of the estate exceeds this nil rate band, then inheritance tax is levied on any amount above that nil rate band, and the inheritance tax rate in the UK is 40%. So this is inheritance tax needs to, if inheritance tax is due, this needs to be paid before any assets can be released to the beneficiaries. So it can be quite a significant number sometimes. 40% is quite a significant tax rate. So how is inheritance tax calculated? Now, this is where it can sometimes get a little bit complex. But first and foremost, you need to value the estate. So somebody's estate includes all of their assets. So that includes things like property, cash, investments, personal possessions, things like vehicles, and also any gifts that have been made within 7 years before their death. And we'll come on to that a little bit later on. But interestingly, as things stand at the moment, anything within pensions are actually excluded from the inheritance tax calculation. So it is a common question that we get asked, what will happen to, my unused pension funds when I die? And the simple answer to that is they can be passed on to whoever you want to benefit, and can do so outside the realms of inheritance tax. It's also important to, when you're valuing an estate, to deduct any debts outstanding. So, for example, if there was a mortgage on a property at death, the value of the debt owed would be deducted from the overall value of the estate. So once you have calculated the value, it's now necessary to apply or consider any allowances or exemptions. So we've touched briefly on the main allowance, so that's the nil rate band. So this represents the threshold below which no inheritance tax is due. So in the UK, the standard nil rate band is 325,000 per individual. So if you think of a married couple, for example, between them they would have a £650,000 worth of nil rate band. So nice and simply, straight away, if the estate is valued below this threshold, then no tax is owed. However, there is also an additional allowance. So this has been brought in relatively recently. It's called the main residence nil rate band. So this was brought in to help try and protect the family home. Okay, so you qualify for this allowance if on death you leave your main residence, so where you live, to a direct descendant, so children, grandchildren. If you are leaving a property to a direct descendant, then you can qualify for the main residence nil rate band. So this is currently £175,000 per person. So in theory, each individual in the UK could have an allowance of £500,000 to put towards inheritance tax. Clearly, if they were a married couple, that combined allowance could be up to £1 million. Now, the little quirk with the main residence nil rate band is that the full amount, the £175,000, can only be used against the property, assuming that it's worth at least that. So what I mean by that is that if you were living in a property that's worth £100,000, you wouldn't get the full £175,000 allowance to use against it. It would be up to the value of the property, which in that example would be £100,000. So it may not be in all situations where the full main residence nil rate band is applicable, but in many cases it may well be. So there are also, again, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but there are additional things that can kind of come back into the calculation for inheritance tax. So gifts. So gifts are a really big one. So if you give an outright gift, so that might be an asset, money, whatever that may be, if that is given within 7 years of death, then it will come back into the calculation. Now, if you gave a gift of, let's say, £20,000 10 years before you died, then it would not be included because it will be outside of that 7-year period. Some gifts are also exempt if they're given for specific reasons. So there is you can give gifts towards things like weddings up to a certain amount, which won't be included in the calculation no matter when it was made. And there are also some annual exemptions, which we'll come on to a little bit later. So once you have valued the estate, deducted any allowances, exemptions, etc., that will give you, I suppose, the net value of the estate. So that will then dictate if the allowances are in excess of the value of the estate, then clearly no inheritance tax is due. If, however, the value of the estate is higher, then clearly inheritance tax will apply. So as we've said, the current rate of inheritance tax in the UK is 40%. So the 40% would only apply on anything in excess of the available allowances. So this next slide, again, just I think these numbers are important ones to remember. So the nil rate band of 325,000 per person, and the main residence nil rate band of up to 175,000 per person. So who pays inheritance tax? So actually, inheritance tax is only an issue for a very, very small number of estates. So in the tax year 2020-2021, only 3.7% of UK deaths actually resulted in an inheritance tax charge. So for the vast majority of people, inheritance tax, or I suppose it's more of a concern for their beneficiaries, but is unlikely to be an issue. It's interesting to note that there are no inheritance tax consequences on transferring assets between spouses. So, for example, if you have a husband and wife, and if the wills state that, you know, on death, our assets go to each other, then on that first death, everything passes to the surviving spouse. There wouldn't be any inheritance tax due or a calculation needed. But upon the second death of the surviving spouse, then that's when the inheritance tax would be due. You can also inherit unused nil rate band, unused main residence nil rate band from your spouse as well. So as you'd probably expect, with inheritance tax only concerning a very, very small number of estates, the actual take for HMRC is actually relatively small. Now, in 2022-2023, HMRC received, you know, in excess of £7 billion as a result of inheritance tax. Now, clearly, that is not an insignificant number, but in the grand scheme of things, for example, you know, the overall tax take in that year was 788 billion. So inheritance tax receipts made up, you know, less than 1% of the overall revenue. However, it was £1 billion higher than the year before, which is quite a significant increase. And I think there's a couple of reasons as to why the take is increasing, I guess, as a monetary figure. Largely because, you know, property prices, you know, continue to appreciate. So especially people that, you know, maybe in the in the south of the country who may have held a particular property for a number of years. They may have seen the value of that increase exponentially over a relatively short period of time, which may well push them into potential inheritance tax territory. And also, although the main residence nil rate band has been brought in, the nil rate band, the 325,000, has actually remained frozen for quite a while. So whilst asset values may be appreciating, actually the thresholds in general have stayed pretty static, which is probably two of the main reasons as to why the overall take is creeping up. So, how to mitigate a potential inheritance tax issue? So, let's say that you've done a calculation of the value of your estate, and you think, well, if I were to pass away tomorrow, then potentially there would be an inheritance tax liability. Now, there are some steps that you can take to mitigate this, but ultimately it depends on, I suppose, how far you are willing to go. So, the simplest way to kind of remove your inheritance tax liability is to simply spend your assets. Okay, so spending your assets until your estate is within your available allowances. Now, clearly, for many people, that may not be an option, especially when a significant proportion of wealth may be tied up in illiquid assets like property. But if there are people that are sitting on large amounts of cash or significant investments, simply spending money, may be a fun way to mitigate inheritance tax issues. Ensuring that you are, utilizing your annual exemptions. So, as I touched on a little bit earlier, there are some allowances that enable you to gift money without it causing a potential future issue. So, for example, each person has an annual gift allowance of £3,000. So you could make that gift and it doesn't fall within that 7-year clock that touched on. Now, each person has this allowance. So, and that again, keep using an example of a married couple. They could each make gifts of up to £3,000 a year without it causing a potential inheritance tax problem. You can also carry forward any unused allowance for the previous year. So let's say you didn't make any gifts last year. You could make £6,000 in 1 year. In the same vein, you can make an unlimited number of small gifts every year, up to the value of £250 per person. So that combined with the annual gift allowance of £3,000 means that over a period of time you could legitimately reduce the value of your estate. But clearly these things have to have some element of forward planning about them, because they're not by themselves, i.e. just doing these things once, are unlikely to make massive differences. But again, over time can result in getting a considerable chunk of money out of your estate. So continuing with the theme of gifting, now this is a little bit of a quirky rule. So if you are in a position where you have regular income that exceeds your expenditure, so for example, you've got employment income or you've got pension income that, basically we've got more money coming in than goes out. Instead of it just kind of accumulating in accounts or in investments or wherever you decide to put it, you can actually gift that surplus income, again without it being included in any future inheritance tax calculation. Now, with this, it's important to maintain records to prove that these gifts are out of regular and surplus income. Because these sorts of things will be investigated on your death, so it's really important to keep important records of everything that you do gift. But regularly gifting from excess income can be a really good way to I suppose prevent any pre-existing inheritance tax liability becoming worse. Because if you think we've got more money coming in than we need on an annual basis, that money just accumulates, and ultimately you are exacerbating your inheritance tax issue if you have one. Gifts to charities. So gifts to registered charities are exempt from inheritance tax. So again, they will not come back into the calculation, even if they're made within 7 years of death. And you can actually also reduce the rate of inheritance tax levied on your estate down to 36% if you decide to leave 10% or more of your estate to charity. So for people that perhaps may not have any beneficiaries that they want to kind of leave their money to, or they would like to leave a proportion to charity, by leaving more than 10% of your estate to charity, you can actually reduce the overall inheritance tax rate that may be applied, again, if you did have a tax liability. So here we're getting into kind of a little bit more complex territory. So larger gifts. So clearly you can gift, whatever you want to whoever you want. But if you are making larger gifts, so by larger gifts I mean in excess of your annual gift allowance of £3,000, and those that aren't out of surplus income, any of these gifts that you do make are deemed to remain within your estate for 7 years. So, like we said before, if you were to die within this time frame of actually making that gift, it will be included in the calculation of valuing your estate. Now, there is what's called taper relief. So meaning that the longer you live within that 7-year period. So let's say you made a gift and you died 5 years later, and it wouldn't be the entire value of the gift made. It would reduce over time to reflect the fact that actually you're actually quite close to being outside of that 7-year window. So it is tapered down, but that is something to remember. And I think the reason that kind of rule exists is to simply it's to stop people on their deathbed, passing over all their assets, to avoid inheritance tax on death. So that is kind of why it exists. And I suppose when you think about it, I suppose it makes sense. So I think an important thing to consider here is that if you are wanting to gift larger sums, or you think that actually in the future you may want to do that, it's probably best to do it earlier in life. So when you're more likely in better health, and ultimately have a probability of surviving for at least 7 years, at which point then it would be outside of your estate. Now, for some people, retaining control of their assets as opposed to gifting is really important. May not want to gift large sums to family members. You may not think that it's appropriate, but at the same time, you may still want to ensure that they don't have an inheritance tax liability to pay, when you do pass away. So there are certain investments that are, potentially exempt from the inheritance tax calculation. Now, these types of investments tend to be, it tends to be a case of you need to hold the investments for at least 2 years. After that 2-year period, they are, assuming you continue to hold them on death, then they will be outside of your estate for that inheritance tax calculation. So this can be a really useful alternative to that 7-year gifting clock, because obviously 2 years is a much shorter time period than 7 years. But clearly, where investments are involved, there is investment risk. The value of what you put into those investments will fluctuate, and there is no guarantee that you will make a return. Indeed, you may actually get back less than you invested. But you could take a viewpoint that, well, actually, the value of my investments would have to go down by, more than 40%, so the rate of inheritance tax, for me to or my estate to be kind of out of pocket, if you like. So IHD friendly investments are an option for people who perhaps may not feel that they'll survive for 7 years and they have health issues, so unwilling to kind of make gifts and have it kind of come back into the estate later on, or in situations where simply, outright gifting isn't appropriate. And finally, you can always insure your inheritance tax liability. So this would involve taking out something like a whole of life policy. So it's effectively a protection policy that would pay out on death, and you can set the sum assured to broadly match your anticipated inheritance tax liability. However, the things with these policies are that the premiums, so what you pay for the insurance, tends to be reviewable. So it'll be reviewed at certain instances along your life. And clearly, the longer you live, the older you are, the more expensive the premiums become. And you could, find yourself in a position where actually to continue the policy, the premiums become unaffordable further down the line, which would then, you've got two choices: either continue to pay it and continue to have the insurance, or you effectively, refuse to pay it and you cancel the policy, but then obviously you're not covered for when death does occur. So ultimately, lots of different options there, and I've tried to kind of order them as I suppose the least taxing down to, I suppose, the most severe, if you like. But there are plenty of different options, and I suppose what's right for you will depend on your individual circumstances, and obviously they are different for everybody. So how do you go about kind of planning for the future? And don't get me wrong, this is difficult because ultimately, one of the biggest unknown variables in our lives is how long are we going to live? So talk of gifting assets earlier on in life can worry people, can make them uncomfortable, because naturally most of us will want to make sure that they are going to have enough themselves before actually giving away or spending more, without having that fear in the back of the mind that, what if we do too much too soon and we run out? So how do you help to make those decisions? Well, the benefits of cash flow modeling can really help to build a clearer picture of what your future may look like. So I think first and foremost, it's important to answer the question of, will I have enough? Can I live the life that I want before, talk of gifting or spending more is considered. So apologies if this graph is a little bit small, but we've got a very, very simple scenario here. So we've got a couple that they're in their early 70s, they're retired. They've got two state pensions, which is denoted by that by the blue section of the bars. They've got in fact, there's a final salary pension, which is the green, and then over time they are using their cash and their investments to top up their spending, which is denoted by that light blue. They also want to make a £50,000 gift to their grandchildren. Not at the moment because the grandchildren are still quite young, but you see that spike later on in the cash flow. That is at the point where they would like to give a gift. Now, clearly, first and foremost, they want to make sure that they can make that gift without it causing them financial problems. And you can see in this scenario that we've assumed a little bit morbid, but we've assumed times when they're going to pass away. But we've modelled this, and it shows that actually assume that they live how long we've expected them to live, that actually they can make that gift without it causing them an issue of, i.e., running out of money. So next up, it's a case of, well, okay, if we did that and we spent how we expected to spend, what is the value of our estate going to look like? So what this graph kind of shows is how the value of their estate changes over time. So very simply here, we've got three categories. We've got property, which is that purple color. We've got the pink color is cash, and the dark blue is investments. So over time, we've made assumptions that property values will continue to increase, and because they're not actually needing to draw large chunks of their investments apart from for that £50,000 gift, we're assuming that actually the investment growth is going to make the values of those plans grow even further. So what this tells us is that by the time of the second death, the assumed value of the estate, so allowing for property appreciation, investment growth, etc., is projected to be around £1.7 million. So based on the current nil rate band and the main residence nil rate bands, so this is around about £700,000 above their exemptions. Plus, we also need to take into account the fact that that £50,000 gift was made within 7 years of the first death. So some quick maths results in a projected inheritance tax liability of around about 280,000 if they continue with their plan. Now, we've got this now that we know that that's what the future may look like. It then allows us to then make some decisions perhaps earlier on. So it may be a case of, okay, well, we gift that money a little bit earlier, we gift more, we spend more. It opens up lots of conversations to have. Putting money into trust, which ultimately is treated the same way as making a gift, but just helps people actually look at the future and say, this is, if we continue down this path, this is a potential outcome. So this is just a very, very basic example of how we can use tools like cash flow modeling to help people understand how their potential future may look. Okay, so just coming to the end of the webinar now, but I think this is a really, really useful slide. So these are our top tips. So firstly, make use of your annual exemptions where possible. So that will be things like the £3,000 gifting allowance, unlimited gifts up to the value of £250 per person, gifts out of surplus income as well. So it's a really useful one. But really importantly, keep a record of any gifts that you do make. So by records, I mean things like who the gift was to, when it was made, how it was made. Was it a bank transfer? Was it cash payments? And how much was gifted? Because this is all information that will need to be ascertained in the event of your death. So keeping records of that, is really, really important. So the third bullet point, nice and straightforward. If you haven't already made a will, make one. And if you have made a will in the past, make sure that it's up to date. So ultimately, the benefits of doing this will be, making sure that the people that you want to benefit on your death do actually benefit. If you are to die without a will, then the laws of intestacy state that your estate has to be distributed in line with kind of strict in a strict order of people. So actually, making a will and making sure that your beneficiaries are listed there and in what proportions is really important. So in the same vein, consider powers of attorney. So these are effectively documents that will allow trusted friends or family members to manage your affairs if you no longer become able to do so. So things like losing capacity, losing mental capacity, or it may even be a situation where perhaps you're abroad, or you're just generally not able to look after your own affairs anymore. It's really important that these documents have to be in place and registered before any event occurs. So once somebody has lost mental capacity, things like dementia, Alzheimer's, becoming increasingly more common for elderly people. Once they are deemed to have lost capacity, it's then too late to put things like powers of attorney in place. So, it's one of those things that hopefully that they're never needed, but it's important to have these drawn up. You can pick who you want to effectively look after your affairs for you if you're no longer able to. And it can just help to make things a lot easier and will result in people being able to make ultimately good decisions on your behalf. So the next one is about life policies. So ensuring that any personal protection policies that pay out on death, so for example, life insurance, are written into trust. So this would mean that in the event of a payout, the money would actually be paid into the trust rather than being paid directly into your estate. The problem with it coming directly into your estate is it's then included in that inheritance tax calculation. So if you have, a chunky life insurance policy to cover a mortgage or maybe to cover a mortgage plus additional funds, if that comes into your estate, that could, could really boost the value of your estate and result in an inheritance tax liability. By placing it into trust, this means the payout will go into the trust. Once within the trust, it can then be paid out to your beneficiaries without it being included in that inheritance tax calculation. Another benefit of placing life policies into trust are that the payouts can generally be a lot quicker. There's no need to wait for probate and things like that, which is typically what needs to happen. Probate needs to be granted before assets in your estate can be released to the beneficiaries. So it can be a really welcome boost to family members if they can get some money quickly via a trust. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, as things stand, pensions are not included in any inheritance tax calculations. So similar to making an update in your will, make sure that you complete a nomination of beneficiary form. It may be sometimes called an expression of wishes with any pension provider that you've got pensions with. Again, this will just mean that, in the event of your death, the people who you want to benefit can benefit. Again, just speeds up the process. And finally, understand that probably a lot of what we kind of talked about in this webinar may seem a little bit daunting for people to kind of do on their own. Speaking to a financial planner and also, in conjunction with a good solicitor as well, can really, really help you make good decisions for the future. Just to finish off, what's next? Well, I thought it was important to address that people may have heard that there are rumours out there at the moment that inheritance tax may be scrapped completely by the current government, with the main aim of kind of, I suppose, winning more favour in I guess the general election. Now, as we've looked at, this would only benefit a very, very small proportion of the population, and let's be honest, it will typically benefit the wealthiest sections of society, the most, because they are, like the likely payers of inheritance tax. But all we can do is base our decisions and choices on the legislation that exists now, and almost more importantly, base our decisions on what we want to do or achieve, with our own lives. And ultimately that will be the driving force in terms of what you decide to do with your money. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. We are a little bit ahead of time, which is always good rather than running on. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you picked up some useful bits of information and it's kind of given some food for thought. If anybody would like to know kind of more about what we do at New World and how we might be able to help, then please reach out. You should all receive a follow-up email with copies of the slides along with other contact information. And please, if anybody does want a copy of the recording, then please just get in touch and we'll send that over to you. So once again, thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.